Organizing for success is vital for any and every single business. We talk about a whole lot of different things as to how you structure, how you get the work done, how you sit down and have a workflow pattern as you go through. One of them is called a division of labor, where you have a person does this job, and this person does this job, and this person does this job. We divide the labor between different people that do it. Sometimes you can change them out even if you want to sit down and break up monotony, but you need to have people accountable for each job. You divide the task through job specialization, and a lot of times you'll take them and put them in specific departments, and we call that departmentalization. The marketing department is fundamentally different than all the tasks and the people involved in the accounting department, which is fundamentally different from the people in the manufacturing department. That's why we call it departmentalization. And for each one, we allocate specific resources, a lot of times through a budget process as we go through. The stuff that's going to happen for resources for accounting will be totally different than the type of resources we allocate for manufacturing in the process. We assign specific tasks. You're in charge of payroll, and you're in charge of revenue accounting, and you're in charge of manufacturing the widget thingies. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, those things. Yeah, and you're in charge of shipping those widgety things. You know what I'm talking? Yeah, okay. You got your jobs. Go do it. You establish procedures to do it this is how you go about doing this. And sometimes if you're going to take an ISO model, we'll talk about that later on, you want to have it all defined exactly who does what under procedures. You have an organization chart that shows the interrelation between the different divisions and sometimes even the different people in there. And then you sit down, if you have a shift, everybody has to adjust to the new realities. The bigger the organization, the more you have what we call economies of scale. We're talking about a lot of different definitions here, and it's all part of the jargon or the language of the world of business. So economies of scale, the bigger the operation, then the cheaper for each individual unit is going to be, because you can have massive amounts of doing it. If you're going to go through and sew and sell polo shirts, okay, a polo shirt, if you sit down and create 100 of them, that's one picture. But if you order 10,000 of them and you get an entire shipping container from Vietnam, the price can be a fraction of what it would be just to buy 100 here in the United States. That's called economies of scale. The cost will be smaller per unit if you buy them in large bulk than if you buy them in smaller quantities. There's a couple people, and seldom do I ever want you to know names of people, but Fayol came up with what he called the principles of organization. We use a lot of these same principles today, but well over 100 years later on. Unity of command. Everybody has one boss. You're accountable to the one boss. A lot of times today, it seems like in a matrix organization, you got a boss for this project here, a boss for this project over here, and a boss for this project over here. It can be very confusing. So you have a unity of command, a hierarchy of authority. Okay, you're an employee here, you have a supervisor here, and there's a manager over the supervisor, and a director over that person, an executive director, and then a vice president, and then the president. You may have a whole series of hierarchy or people in higher rank and lower rank within an organization. Division of labor, subordination of the individual to the interest of the whole. In other words, what you want to have just for your department of marketing, you sit down and have to pay attention to how the whole organization is operating, including if you want to sell the product, you better have the product for manufacturing to sell. You have a role of authority. Okay, somebody's in charge and they're held accountable for what happens in the whole area that they're in authority over. The degree of centralization. Sometimes when you centralize it, you can have a much better economy of scale and have uniform practice. But one of the problems is by high centralization, then you start losing touch with the customer, which is better for a degree of decentralization. Clear communication channels, making certain that you have a good talking between the upper and lower levels of the organization in order. And equity. Now, by the way, we'll talk more about equity in chapter 10. Equity is a big motivator, so we'll talk about that. And then a spirit de course, having everybody happy and enthusiastic about following the organization as it leads to the whole process. So Henry Fayol, he introduced these principles, and we still follow almost all of them today as you go through. It was upgraded by a guy named Max Weber in organizational theory. He took the fail principles and he started translating them into workable tools that we have. We still have job descriptions, which is very common, and we'll talk about those later on. Written rules, decision guidelines, detailed records, consistent procedures, regulations, and policies. Do you know where the term red tape comes from? Red tape actually originates back in Great Britain. They used to sit down and take annual records, and they would take red tape and actually double tape them, one in this direction, one in this direction, and they would put them in storage. And so that way, when we talk about cutting the red tape, that means actually going down, grabbing a stack of a year's records and cutting the red tape, looking for it, and then retaping it up. That's where it comes from the aspect of Weber and keeping records in the process. Making certain your staffing promotion is based upon different levels of expectations that you want to have. So we still see a lot of the stuff today that we use between Fail and Weber as we go through and the organization as we go through and look at the different things like hierarchies you go through, a chain of command, an organization chart, a chart where you map out who reports to what in a relationship. The centralized authority. It's one of these things you argue about all the time, and you'll see a wave in organizations, typically every 10 years or so, let's all centralize it. We can save a lot of money because nobody's talking to each other rightly. So we'll have somebody in charge. And so a lot of times you get an organization where you have central administration is in charge of everything. And then after a while it says, you know what, we've lost touch with our customers. We need to decentralize. So let's decentralize. So for the next 10 years, they decentralize. And then eventually someone comes back and says, we're so sloppy, we need to centralize. And you'll see a wave in an organization as it goes up and down in centralization. It just depends what you want at that moment it's come through. So for organizing for success, know the principles of Bayle's principles of command, and then Weber's chain of command, the hierarchy, the structure. Know the concept too of centralization and decentralization. We'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. With that, make certain that if you're part of the organization of a business, that the organization you have makes sense for the staff and the customer. Take care.